Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, depending on your time zone, and welcome to this webinar from Veeam Software about GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation. My name is Mike Resseler. I'm a director working for Veeam in the Product Management R&D division. And today, as you might have guessed, our topic is going to be GDPR or General Data Protection Regulation. Now I see still lots of people coming in. Welcome, but I've got lots to talk about. I will need almost the entire hour. I will certainly try to take some time at the end of this webinar for Q&A. So please, if you have questions, use the virtual Q&A in your panel. I'll try to answer those as good as I can at the end of this webinar. I'm pretty certain that most of the questions you might ask will be answered during the course of this webinar, but in case if it's not true, I'll have a look at the end. So what are we going to do today? We're going to talk about GDPR, obviously, and the first part of this webinar, which I'm going to try to keep as short as possible, I'm quickly going to talk about some key concepts about GDPR, a few of the terms you need to know, especially some of the terms that you might misinterpret because it's a legal naming, and sometimes, you know, when you read it, you think about something, but in fact, they mean something else. So just a few of those, just to get you started with it. And then what we're actually going to do is in part two, we're going to look at the journey that Veeam has done. So in that part, what I'm going to tell you is what we have done over the past year and a half, maybe even a little bit longer by now, when we started our own journey to become GDPR compliant. And finally, after that, for those, we still have a third part for those who are interested. We also going to tell you what parts of our own software that we use to prove that we are GDPR compliant if needed against auditors. Now, in all honesty, that is just a small part of the entire regulation. So what I'm going to show you are pieces that we use from our own software, but it's not the only software that we use. It's not the only tool we use. It's not the only workflow we use, because GDPR is so big that if you want to solve this, it's really about people, workflows, different tools, software, and so on, as we will see in a couple, well, within this hour. All right, so let's get started and let's talk about those key concepts. So first, when you start, reading about GDPR, there are a few key concepts that you really need to understand the legislation itself. Now, some of them, as I already said, are not really 100% clear for everyone. So let's quickly run over a few of those, right? So the most important thing that you need to learn is the definition of what GDPR considers personal identifiable information. For the rest of this webinar, you're probably going to hear me refer to this as PII data, right? Some also refer to this as personal data, but in the end, it's any data that can identify a living individual. Important here is that it's not only your name, your last name, your home address, and things like that, but it really includes data which you probably would not expect immediately. Think about, for example, your IP address. That itself is also considered PII data, okay? The second thing which we need to talk about is processing. And it's again, one of these definitions that's really defined very, very broadly. If you're very simply storing data, even if it's, from someone else, if it's encrypted, so think about cloud providers that are storing data, think about your service provider that's storing data. But according to this definition of the Europe regulation, it actually means you are processing the data. So in that point in time, you're actually becoming part of the GDPR legislation. Now, if it works, yeah, here we go. The data controller is actually the owner of the data. That's the person who decides the purpose. For what do I have that data? What am I going to do with it? And how is it going to be processed, right? And then the data processor kind of comes back to that second definition of processing. It's the one that will process, and again, remember, it's a really broad definition, but it will process the data on behalf of the data controller. Now, obviously, in some cases, you can understand that the data controller and the data processor are the same persons, but it's two different definitions within that legislation. Now, the data subjects are actually the persons or individuals to whom the data itself relates. So we're talking about that PII data, while the data subject is the person, whose IP address it is, whose name it is, whose last name it is, and so on, right? Pretty important here if you're working for a company and you're going to be partly responsible for GDPR or for any legislation for that matter. You as a company, your employees are also data subjects and they need to be treated as those as well. So whatever you're doing for GDPR to the outside world, be aware that you need to do that inside your own company as well. Another thing is sensitive personal data. It's more strict category from that PII data. One of the examples could be DNA data, but depending on some of the definitions, you might see that religion, for example, could be considered as sensitive personal data as well. And finally, quickly, let's talk about notification. And this is rather important because when there's an issue, you need to alert the correct authorities in due time. Okay. One mistake you could make, I haven't started yet about the lessons that Veeam learned, but when I'm at the subject, one thing you really should investigate as soon as possible is which authorities do I need to contact and how do I contact them? Because we did a little exercise and we wanted to simulate a breach, right? And we wanted to see, okay, who do we need to contact? And we actually kind of lost quite a lot of time just figuring out, okay, who do we need to contact? So it's really something stupid, but it's a good tip that you actually have that data somewhere that in case something happens, you can notify them without needing without needing to search the entire internet where you need to notify. Now, besides some concepts, let's look at some key principles as well, right? And we believe that those 8 key principles here are rather important to know. So GDPR is actually just an improved version of a previous legislation. Improved, we'll talk about that because obviously technology is changed. There's something like social media now, but it's also going to be a very much a stronger enforcement of the rules. And if you look at the data protection authorities, they will be able to find organizations who breach the rules. And in the legislation, you're going to read up to 4% of their annual global turnover or 20 million euros, whichever is greater. Now, don't be too scared of these numbers because that means you really have some serious breaches to those rules. It also states in smaller print maybe, but you can also read in the legislation that if you breach the rules, you won't immediately get that large fine. The fines will be building up depending how severe it is, and who knows, in the beginning you might get away with a warning, although don't ever say that Veeam has said that or that I have said that, but that's what we assume, and that's going to be dependent, obviously, what we're going to see after the 25th of May. Another one is a fact of companies processing personal data of people in EU. I have another slide on this one, but realize it's really, really important. It's not just for companies within the European Union, and I'll come back to that. The data protection officer, do check whether you need it as a company. It's rather important. In our case, we need one. Some companies will not need one. It really depends on your company, on your size, on your vertical. So do make that check whether you need a DPO. But even if you don't need to have a DPO, it's always good in your company, how small it is, to make somebody responsible for this legislation so that he or she can, look at the workflows, look at the rules, make some adaptations, and so on and so forth. We already talked about notifying the authorities in the previous slide, and let's see about consent. Now, consent must stand out, use clear language, and include the reason the data is being gathered. Now, that sounds pretty difficult, but in the end, what it means is whenever you're collecting information from someone, whether it's outside your company, whether it's for marketing purposes, whether it's through access on your website, or it's within your company from your employees, you need to make sure that those people are informed why you are collecting that data. And it has to be within clear language, which maybe means that all these terms and conditions will become a little bit more easier to read. So be aware of that needs to change as well. Then a right to be forgotten, right? If you look at, people can decide to revoke access to their data, or people have the right to obtain, change, move, and delete their data. Now, if a person no longer wants their data to be processed, and obviously if there's no legal reasons to keeping it, the data will be deleted. This is about protecting the privacy of the individuals, but it's not about erasing past events. It's not about restricting freedom of the press. And also note, and I'll come back to that one later on as well, because it's rather important, the right to be forgotten is not absolute at all. It's not because somebody asks to be forgotten that you are forced to do it. It really depends on certain cases, but we're going to get back to that, right? So these are a few things that you need to think about. Just the last one, which I want to talk about as well, is data protection by design, by default. It's about privacy, it's about security, and it's also about the fact that you need to be able to get that data back in case something is happening or has happened. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. Well, just a few additional ones, because this is really something which I'm seeing a lot in the conversations I have with companies. Probably one of our biggest tips we can give, and something you really need to understand, is that becoming GDPR compliant is absolutely not an IT issue alone. Becoming GDPR compliant is something which can only be achieved when different business units work together. Now, IT can certainly be a stakeholder here, but technology cannot be the solution itself. It just can't. Only if you're going to combine workflows, if you understand the demands of the different stakeholders, and if you're going to create and build processes with those different teams, then you will be able to get compliant. The other tip, we already talked about it very shortly, it's not about EU companies alone. Many organizations worldwide are still telling me, yeah, but GDPR, it's not important for me. We're not Europe-based. It's really not correct. The moment you own personal data of organizations, of citizens of the EU, you're obliged to follow the regulation for that data. So basically, if you're an organization outside of Europe and you don't want to comply with the regulation, you cannot do business, you cannot collect data from any EU organization or citizen, which is probably unlikely in today's global world. Just think about it. If you are actually having a website somewhere in, I don't know, a country outside of Europe, South Africa, for example, and you're collecting a name and a last name and maybe an email address to download the white paper, how are you going to block Europeans from doing that? So from the moment you have a website and you collect some data, there's the potential that you're doing business with EU citizens, companies, and you need to be compliant with this regulation. The right to be forgotten, not absolute, rather important, because a lot of organizations are scared of this, especially about this specific rule. Now, European citizens are receiving the right to ask for the deletion of their data that you as an organization owns. I already said it, this right is not absolute. Besides GDPR, there's obviously other laws in your countries, right? I'm giving you a very simple example. Imagine that you're a customer and you purchase something from a company, websites, e-commerce, buy something. But the day afterwards, you exercise your right to be forgotten as that customer. So the company now cannot use your data anymore to send marketing, newsletters, and those kind of things, but they do need to keep your data for the purchase for as long as that local law requires. Now, depending on the vertical, that could actually mean very, very long time, many, many years. By the way, this also means, and this is also a question I get a lot, is that you're not required to delete the information from your backups. However, looking at the marketing newsletter again, If you're going to restore data back into production when a recovery is needed for whatever reason, then obviously that data cannot come back into production, and suddenly you cannot start sending email marketing letters again to that person. So keep that in mind. All right, let's have a look at the lessons that we have learned with Veeam, right? Um, I'm not going to talk about marketing here, but just those numbers are just to show you that we are an international company with customers, employees all over the world. We've got over 250,000 customers, and we really can say that GDPR is something very important for us, something we as a company need to be ready for. We started our own journey, as I already said, over 1 year and a half ago, and to make sure that all of our processes, all of our workflows are compliant with the legislation. Now, every organization is obviously unique, so every organization will require different work to become compliant. But what we believe is, from everything we've learned from our own journey, that those lessons can actually help anyone out there and potentially save your organization a lot of time and work. Now, this might surprise you, but at Veeam, we actually welcome the new GDPR legislation. The one before GDPR, the predecessor, called the Data Protection Directive, it was created in 1995. Now, at that point in time, smartphones didn't exist. The internet certainly was a different place. For those of you who are old enough, like myself, they will probably still remember something which you could call the internet. But with all the new technologies and services that exist today, this new directive was really a much needed update on that old one. It really was necessary to protect your personal data better. Now, because Veeam went and actually is still going through the process of becoming GDPR compliant, we're obviously aware that this causes quite some work, right? And over the past months, we really have spent quite some time, a lot of effort, and actually a lot of money as well on this journey. And still, we're actually happy that this legislation is coming because we believe it's good for the future for everybody. But we worked together with consultants. We hired consultants, we hired legal specialists, we had many others to go through this process. And when things really become clear and we knew what we needed to do, and we're starting the projects, and we're in the process of adapting workflows and changing all kind of things. Our management has decided, what, all of these things we learned, let's share as much as we can, information, insights, templates with all of you, to guide you through your own efforts of becoming compliant. As I already said, each organization is unique. You will need to adapt our lessons learned to your own specific needs, but we do believe that our general framework can be used by each company on their journey to become compliant. So, Veeam's lessons learned from all that work and resources, that we spent can be brought back to 5 lessons or 5 important basic principles that you can use yourself. And lesson 1 or principle 1 is identify the PII data that you collect, that you have, and who has access. And we're going to go deeper into those one by one, obviously. Number 2 is make sure that you start establishing the rules to process, to access, and to use that PII. And again, we're going to go a little bit deeper on it and give you some hints and tips there. Number 3 is about protecting the data, implementing, ensuring security controls, protecting the information, responding to data breaches, right? The 4th step we took in our journey, or the 4th principle, is document those processes, execute on data requests, and then reporting. Report any issues or data breaches within those guidelines. And it's pretty important, that step as well. And then the last one is something which apparently a lot of companies are forgetting, and they're like, well, we're doing this project now for GDPR, and it should be ready by the 25th of May 2018, because at that moment, everything is in effect and you could get fines. It's actually not true. The digital world is changing all the time. We really believe at Veeam, well, we are a technology company, so we believe that our digital world will change more in the next 5 years than it has in the last 10 years, which means you're going to have to constantly evaluate test your existing procedures and protocols, and evolve and enhance them depending on what new is coming. So the journey doesn't stop the 25th of May. You will need to continuously look at it and change your procedures, processes, and so on. All right, let's go a little bit deeper in those lessons. So let's start with number one. The first lesson is know your data, right? So the first thing what you need to do if you start this project is identify if your organization has PII data of a EU resident. Now, I can assure you, I had conversations with organizations, they said they didn't until you realized, you asked them some questions and they realized that they actually had that information. And I already explained that PII is a very broad category of information. The real definition is any data that can be used to identify an individual. And we already said that you're going to think about name, contact information, pictures, but IP addresses, location data through an app on your smartphone, feedback forms, data from reward programs. Think about, for example, reward programs such as airline reward programs and things like that. All can be considered PII, right? I already talked about sensitive PII as well. Not going to go too much deeper in that, but do be aware it exists as well, right? And again, I'm going to stress out, it's not only about that external data. Inside your organization, your employees' data, mostly with HR, at least I hope it's mostly with HR, that is PII as well. And the moment you have one European employees, even if it's not a real staff member, but a contractor, that means you need to be aware of what that data as well and have the right rules and procedures. Now, the moment you identified it and you know what your PII data is that you own, then you're actually going to have to understand and define who has access to that data. GDPR is extremely strict on who can view what kind of data, and only persons that need to access it with good reasons, which should be defined in the terms of contract. I'll come back to that one a little bit later on, what we're talking about when collecting data through a website, the terms and conditions that you sign, but it needs to be defined in there. Only those persons can have access. Now, build really a clear map of who has access and what of type of access they have. What I mean by that is don't just say, okay, person A has access and person B has access. No. Can they read it? Can they read all of it? Can they modify it? And this actually needs to be done, and this is a tricky one, which many people forget, on every copy of that data. So if the data is somewhere in production, then obviously you're going to search there. But what if the data is also in a backup or in a copy that you have in another data center? You need to be aware who has access to it as well and for what reason. If you've done that, then it's still not enough. You also need to be aware of where the data lives. Again, this is not only the data on the production service, but also on any copy of that data that you have. Now, GDPR only allows the transfer of data to non-European countries which are known to apply the same rules. Now, this list of countries is not definite, that it can really change depending on the measurements those countries take around data privacy. That also means that, within a half year, a country could be part of a safe country, and then 2 years later, other countries might drop off or something like that. Now, data that you own and that resides in your own data centers, that's probably easy to say, okay, we know that that data is somewhere in Belgium, and we know that that data is somewhere in Germany, for example, right? But what about the data that actually is living on cloud services? Are you actually aware where it's physically located? Because you need to be aware of that. So make sure you have that data as well. So that brings me to identify, do we have PII data? What is it? Who has access to it? And what is the location? Now, one of the things we've learned is that it's very interesting. It takes some time, but it's very interesting to create flowcharts of that data. Where is it being collected? For example, through the website. To what place is it being transferred? We're storing that data in some sort of database, which is located on data servers living in Belgium. What is being done with it? Well, we use that data to send out our weekly interesting newsletter. Who has access to it? Well, the persons that are sending those newsletters, they have access to that data, right? Now, a flowchart will give you that visual indication of all the answers to those questions. As I said in the beginning, it's really, really time consuming. And once you're done, this is a continuous process because some things will change and you need to adapt those flowcharts and so on. But look at it as an investment in the future. Your DPO or the GDPR responsible will have with this a full view of the processing of the data in a flowchart. It will make his work or her work really much easier. And as I said afterwards, quickly adapting those flowcharts will really, really become much easier. Another thing we believe is important is review all of your opt-ins. Many of your organizations will probably have a checkbox, somewhere at this point in time on your website or somewhere else where they said, if you leave your data here, you give us the right to, and so on and so forth. We do advise you to review all of those and adapt them where necessary. We actually saw that for some organizations, it actually means that you need to resend an email to your entire contacts database and ask them permission again because your previous opt-in wasn't sufficient, so you need to ask it again. So not fun, obviously, because you will lose quite some details in your contact database, but something you really need to do if they're not up to date. All right, let's jump to lessons 2. We've done the exercise of lesson 1. We know our data. We probably created those data maps, but now we've done it. We need to manage our data, and it's rather crucial to start this as soon as you've done the first lesson or the first exercise. Otherwise, you're gonna need to redo the first principle again. My advice would be start preparing this principle while doing the mapping of the data. So the moment that mapping of the data is done, you can start with this as well, not to lose or not to redo lesson 1. Now, in most organizations, PII data will most probably be stored on specific data sources. Think, virtual machines, physical machines, cloud instances. And we actually noticed that many organizations are using specific software, most probably working only on production data, that tags that specific data. However, we noticed that it's also important to tag the holders of that data. Again, the virtual machines, physical machines, cloud instances, right? Now, if your software solution has a tagging system, use it to tag every instance that owns PII data. The reporting out of that software solution, and we're going to talk about this in principle or lesson number 4, could then be based on the tagging, making the DPOs live again, so you don't need to extract data out of reports on a regular basis or when there's an audit. So if you're tagging data, whether it's production data, copy data, or something like that, don't only copy the data itself, copy the holders of the data as well to make your life a little bit more easier for other articles within GDPR. One major pitfall that I want to talk about you is that you're probably going to want to use the same processes, the same workflows on PII data. Now this could be really, really bad for the productivity of your business. Literally, don't fall in the old IT trap of trying to handle everything the same way. Here at Veeam, we realized very quickly that different departments have really different needs. For example, marketing has really different needs for the data within our company than what sales does with our data. So at Veeam, what we did, we used surveys. And we're actually going to make those available free for download, so you can question the different needs to map the processes and workflows based on those needs within the different departments. But realize that within your organization, you probably have different stakeholders, and you might need to create different processes and workflows depending on their needs. Now, another one is partnerships. Many organizations will form partnerships with other companies and share PII data, through joint campaigns, sales, marketing efforts, and so on. But it could also be a simple partnership with a software as a solution vendor for your internal HR data. Now, in our case, we have, as an example, we have a partnership with Workday for HR. It's a software as a service solution. Now, we work together already with Workday to make sure that the data that their software is processing, which is our data, is processed according to the right rules. Now, another example could be our partnership with NetApp. Now, before NetApp wanted to share any data with us, for marketing campaigns, for example, they sat together with us to make sure that we are compliant with the new rules. Obviously, we did the same thing with them. We said, all right, you know now what we are doing, but what are you doing with that data? And we looked through their processes and workflows and saw that they are being compliant with GDPR as well. So think about this, what partnerships you have, and make sure that both of you are compliant. Now, for those of you who heard me talk about campaigns, sales, marketing, ever say, hey, we're not doing this, so no worries from in my case. Probably a simple example to state that most of the organizations worldwide will have partnerships is Microsoft Office 365. So think about it as well. If you're using Microsoft Office 365 or any of those type of cloud services, then you are actually having a partnership. They are the data processor, as I talked about in the beginning, which means you need to check whether they're doing their GDPR job or not. Now, in the first exercise, we search who has access. Now, really, this is the moment you have identified all of that, to review all of the person's business units who have access to certain data. Why do they have access? It should be clear from the flowcharts that you created in exercise 1. Now, speaking in an IT language, this is kind of the moment to remove usernames from access control list entries and start working with security groups or distribution groups alone. Some people will certainly have access to data which, they might have needed years ago, but have absolutely not needed anymore. Revise it, adapt it, let your DPO or the assigned responsible revise those access lists on a regular basis and withdraw access when it's not needed anymore. No more from the IT world saying, oh, why do you need this access? No. You can now point to the DPO. He or she will give that permission, yes or no. I already talked about this, the right to be forgotten, not absolute, but you need to retire data after its use. Now, this will depend on your local law, on the vertical which you operate, but this also counts for the copies of that data, right? I already said do not delete the data from your backups. However, when the legal time is over for that data, you really should consider, and you should actually do, retire those backups as well. When you don't officially need the data anymore, just make sure it's away. All right, we're on a roll. We've got 2 lessons done. Now we're going to go for number 3, and that's protecting the data. And it's really crucial. And unfortunately, from the conversations we have with organizations, it's not fully considered. Now, security here is important, right? The point what I want to make here is when we're talking about protecting the data, many organizations talk about firewalls, network security, access control lists, antivirus measurements, and and so on. It's not about security alone. Again, really important. But when the European Union talks about protecting the data, they talk about security and data protection by design. This means more than security alone, and we're going to see that in the next slides. Think about your internal security. We already talked about who has access to what data, and you should be able to actually audit that. Also, processing on that data should be audited. Now, most loss of data occurs because of internal mistakes, we know that, and it used to be enough to simply recover the data, but now you're actually going to need to prove, when needed actually, what happened and report on it. Now, I'm going to talk about that a little bit later, but think about that. You need to do all of these reportings. And it's not just about that type of reporting at all. It's also about your physical access restriction. If any unauthorized persons has access to your data center, or even to the computer of their coworker, that has additional access, then basically you're having a breach and you need to report on it. So keep that in mind as well. We've been saying this for years and we're going to have to repeat this probably for many, many more years. Co-workers cannot lend their password to another one and so on and so forth, but it is something you need to take into account within this new legislation. End-to-end encryption, data is vulnerable when it's being moved over the network. Whether this is internal or external, when the data is in transit, somebody can steal it, can take it. But it's also vulnerable when it is at rest. This is production data. This is also for copies of that data. So wherever your data is, make sure that you use that end-to-end encryption for the data, especially when the data physically leaves the European Union or when the data goes to certain cloud solutions. When we talked about auditing 2 slides or 3 slides ago, we mentioned that you needed to be able to prove what happened to the data. One of the tips and the lessons we learned here is that organizations only will look through monitoring solutions or auditing data when something has already happened. Actually, GDPR should force you or should at least motivate you to do this now continuous so that you can act when something happened, whether it's an audit, where it's an incident or something else. Continuous monitoring means it's not only about the data itself, right? Also monitor your infrastructure on premises, hybrid, cloud, monitor closely and continuously. Why is that? Because if you only keep an eye on the data and your infrastructure dies, well, you still have no data, you still have an incident and you still need to report on it and you need to recover as quickly as possible. So don't lose everything out of sight. Don't look at data alone. It's the entire setup which is important here. Data availability in many cases, it's seen as something which is that needs to be done. Nobody likes it. Nobody wants to do it. To back up, those kind of things, disaster recovery. But GDPR now forces you to think about this by design. And that means that each new project that you implement within your organization, you will need to have recoverability and security designed in from the beginning. Now, this is really a major shift in thinking for many companies, many departments, because let's be honest, we always, wanted to implement a project, and from the moment it goes live or into production, they say, oh, right, and now we need the backup. Oh, wait, then we need to have some new firewall rules, and so on and so forth, right? From now on, you need to start, okay, this is a new project, great, but let's add some time, let's add some effort, let's add some money to look at recoverability, to look at security as a whole for that project. Because in the end, GDPR requires you to recover that data as soon as possible in case something happened with it. Good. We're on a roll, and the good thing is the way we were moving now, we kind of have done already a lot, but then we need to look at the 4th lesson, and that's documentation and complying. Searching, locating, correcting, even deleting, depending on the ask of PII data is a really, exhaustive, tough process. As I said in lesson 1, the first time it's the worst process, takes a lot of time. So you want to avoid doing this, every time, again and again and again. So what we're seeing is that many organizations are looking for solutions that can identify such data automatically, which is good, or build the processes that the data is always at a known location. Think, for example, specific VMs, specific physical workstation servers, cloud instances, or something like that. But make sure that you don't forget about those copies. I've been saying this already a couple of times, but it's because I'm seeing this in every conversation. They talk about their data and they forgot that they have copies of it somewhere. Those actually need to be identified, searchable, and so on as well. So if you need to do this process first, which is a costly process for your production data, try to avoid doing that for any other than the production data. Have specific solutions in place that can do all of these actions on those copies as well. Transfer of data. When you own the data of a person, that person is actually allowed to request the data, and you need to deliver it in an easy to use format. What we learned, the best way to do is simply to recover the data from the last copy, so you don't interfere with the production data. Just go into one of these copies, export the data into a known format, and that is actually going to be crucial if you receive this request. But again, if you have identified your data in lesson 1, if you know the location, then searching through that copy with the right tools, obviously, should be easily and fast done. So I'm coming to number 5, and let's talk about continuously improve. 25th of May 2018, the day that the grace period for GDPR stops. So from that moment on, there's a possibility you're going to get audits and fines can be given. As I said already, we noticed in our research that many companies believe that GDPR project will end that day. No, this is just the beginning. Even if you finish all of the 4 steps, you open a bottle of champagne, you say, yay, we're done, we're ready, but then you need to continuously improve. Obviously, you will not need to spend as much efforts, resources, and so on anymore on it, but it needs to continue as such. Your DPO will need to make adjustments based on the reporting, on the dashboards. New projects will need to fit into the overall vision, and changes will need to be incorporated. And the reason I kind of already said, right, we operate and we live in a very interesting and fascinating time with a really fast changing digital world. But on the other hand, that also means that data privacy and protection are responsibilities that will only increase, and we need to keep up with that fast changing digital world. Now, your DPO or the designation person, it will need to constantly review the processes, procedures for data privacy and protection. We already said it, deadline is close, the journey just begins. Don't be afraid to adapt whenever it's necessary. Out of our experience, we learned now over the last year and a half, just start with your processes, procedures, workflows, and adapt them as you learn what could be better. Don't try to figure out the best procedure before you go live. Just come with one nice procedure or multiple procedures, obviously. Start working with it, and then based on the feedback you get, improve it and adapt it to make it better. Dashboards are going to be pretty crucial for your DPO or the responsible. In all honesty, a single solution showing all of the data, we don't think it exists, or at least we haven't found it. So together with the owners of the workloads, together with the DPO, with the IT responsible, with the data owners, you're going to need to find the best dashboard for each solution. Some solutions you might be able to combine, and for others, you're going to need to find out if that solution itself can deliver the right dashboard. Do know that you need to be able to use those dashboards in case of an audit. The same actually goes for reporting. Again, you're going to need to make a decision to use deep level reports coming from the solution itself, or more general reports coming from other solutions that can read out the data of a specific workload, right? What is important in that decision is what data the DPO needs. And that answer to that question should come from the surveys, which I already talked about, and that you can use in cooperation with IT for the infrastructure side, with the DPO on the business side, and then you know what data you need to deliver to the DPO. So what about Veeam, right? Where can we help? Do we have something within our software that can make you GDPR compliant? The answer is software cannot make you compliant. There's not a single software, a single hardware solution that can make you compliant. If there's somebody out there claiming, hey, our software will make you GDPR compliant or is GDPR compliant, that's lying, because at this point in time, there's no certification as such. We already talked about this for the last 45 minutes, right? Becoming GDPR compliant, it's a process. It includes workflows, it includes processes, people, software. Um, what you can do and what you should do is which software can actually help my organization. What reports, what functionality comes with a certain type of software that will help your organization in that journey to GDPR. So as an example, I'm obviously going to take GDPR and I'm going to talk quickly about a few things. Location, right? I said location, knowing where that data physically is located, important to GDPR. Obviously, not only the production data, but also the backups, the backup copies, the replicas, the tape locations. Don't forget about those tapes you probably still use. Now, what we've built is reports that are available that give you an entire overview where that data lives, from the production to the tape. And when you want to restore data to a different location than the original production location, we will give you as a company or as a software a warning to avoid human mistakes. It's a little thing, but it's rather important, and it gives you that reporting that your DPO needs. We talked about data protection and security by design, and we also discussed that you need to bring back the data online as soon as possible in case something happens to it, right? At Veeam, we pioneered Sure Backup, Sure Replica as the solution to test whether your backups and replicas are actually usable in case of an issue. Through that virtual lab technology which we use, you can start the machine, see where it runs, run scripts inside to test, to verify that all is working, and all of this can be done in an automated way. Again, reporting exists so you can prove to an audit or to your DPO, yes, we're testing that data, yes, we test where it's recoverable or not. We also talked about importance of tagging. Through Veeam One, which is part of the Veeam Availability Suite, you can actually tag the virtual machines, physical servers, cloud instances that contain PII data. And based on those tags, you can create those reports and dashboards for your DPO to give him or her only the information that he needs or she needs to make sure that you're compliant, right? So he or she doesn't have to search through all of that massive data that you own, which might not always be relevant. Analytics, dashboards, reporting, monitoring. We already said Veeam One, part of the availability suite, tagging of your data copies, but also your entire backup infrastructure, including the virtual infrastructure. Based on those, you can create those reports, monitors, dashboards, I already said that, and then the scoping with the tagging, right? But besides that, it can also help you maintain records of processing, which are done on the data copies. So not on the production data, but on the data copies, and is actually something required under Article 30. Data retention, we talked about it. Keep your data for only as long as it needed, right? So Veeam, our software, gives you the potential to retire your data copies at a certain age, depending obviously on the needs, the requirements, the legislation, the vertical, and so on. About recovery, again, data protection by design and by default. We talked about Sure Backup, Sure Replica to test the recoverability of your data. But in case you need to recover, you can actually do this in various ways. Single data copy, full recoveries, different locations if needed, item level recoveries, and so much more. Everything you need to quickly recover the data back to production, depending on the case you have, right? The different recovery types, usage of virtual labs, or even the Veeam Explorers also give you the possibility to recover the data into a common format in case data portability is requested and you need to reply to. Instant recovery, recoveries that need to go fast. Again, a technology which we have pioneered, but starting the machine from the backup file will give you instant access to the data again. At the same time, then obviously you will be able to transfer the data back to the original location while keeping it available at all times. It might not be much, and many solutions have this, but obviously we also deliver the possibility for end-to-end encryption, both in transit and at rest, making sure that the data is safe when it's being transferred from production to a backup, to a replica target, especially when it leaves your premises and goes somewhere else. Impact assessment is it's an interesting one actually. Article 35 says that you need to perform an impact assessment each time you will be doing maintenance or updates, upgrades to the data itself, or to the supporting workloads or infrastructure where your data makes use of. So think about Windows updates, think about firmware upgrades, think about, well, everything you can imagine actually. Now, using our virtual lab technology again, you can safely test those major changes by performing it on the last backup. You will be easily able to assess the impact, write your change documentation, and then make sure that you can perform it on the production data also, and obviously do the reporting on it so that you're safe in case of a failure, an audit, or whatever. RBAC, who has access to your data? We talked about this in the beginning. In this case, with Veeam, it's who has access to the copies of the data. Veeam has role-based access control, so you can define who has access, and through the reporting of Veeam 1, you can actually log the activities and report on it. We discussed that discovery is important. Sometimes you need to do additional discovery. It depends on what is needed. It depends on requests from European citizens. It depends on a potential request of an audit or whatever. So sometimes your DPO is going to need to do some additional, some more discoveries, for whatever is necessary. Now, you can either do that on the production data with some risks, or you can do this again on the latest backup. And again, that virtual lab can help you here. You let your DPO play on it. Even if something goes wrong, you just remove the virtual lab, nothing has happened, right? And then besides that, we've got guest indexing. We've got our Veeam Explorers that exist for many well-known workloads like SQL, Oracle, SharePoint, Exchange, and so on. Those are a great tool to do e-discovery. But again, this is just to show you that this will only work, right, for the copies of the data, but it's to show you that each software solution will have certain functionality somewhere that can assist you in that GDPR, right? We've got 11, 12 different articles where we can assist you, but in total there are like 99 articles or something, so it's not enough. So you're going to have to figure out for each software solution where can help me, right? And I believe this one is the last one. Yeah. Sometimes, depending on specific data, you're not allowed to protect it, especially around sensitive data, or sometimes it's data which is not reusable after a short period of time. Make sure you exclude that data from backups, from replicas, from those copies of your data, which you can do based on virtual machines, disks, even files and folders when using our agent technology, and that will keep you in compliance at all times. All right. Before I actually going to close, I promised I was going to look at the questions, so let me open that Q&A. All right. And let me look at a few of those questions you have. So, very good question, actually, if I understand it correctly, at least. Processor, even just looking at data is processing? Yes, exactly. Storing data, even if it's encrypted, by the way, which means you can't look at it. Still, if you're storing the data, you're processing it. So processor is really, really broadly defined. And yes, looking at it is processing data as well. How exactly are going to penalize companies that have no location in the EU? There's nothing for them to go after. Very good question, Ben. And to be honest, at this point in time, we are not certain. On the other hand, if you look at what the European Commission is being doing, they have penalized Facebook, they have penalized Google, and officially they're not located in the EU as well. So maybe some companies might get away with it because they're small and they don't have literally nothing to do in the EU, but I wouldn't be too sure that they start making agreements with other countries and they can still come after you. So I personally would never take that risk. I have contact information for EU citizens in my email address book. Is something that simple being subject to GDPR? Phil, yes it is, but let me make sure that you don't get scared now. What you probably have is name, last name, maybe phone number, email address, something like that, right? So, and if it's in your email address book, you probably received it by getting an email or by, you know these people and so on, which kind of means that the purpose of the collection of that data is very simple. You talk to those people. As long as you don't use those contacts from that email address book to start sending out unsolicited emails, such as marketing and those kind of things, which they haven't agreed upon, then you don't have to worry about anything. This law is specifically made for the larger companies in this world, for the marketing companies in this world. If you receive data from somebody through his email, it's by exchanging email that you get the data. It's not that tight or that tight. Let's see. Is hardware encryption like BitLocker sufficient to satisfy the encryption data at rest requirement? Yes, yes. So actually, when the EU talks about end-to-end encryption, at rest and so on, what they will refer to is to look at your other legislations and see what type of encryption you need to have there. And BitLocker, as you know, is very sufficient for many of those legislations. Um, Thank you very much for the nice comment. Not going to read that out, but one of the questions you have, we are allowed to hold PII data as long as the user is aware we're holding it, like in terms and conditions. Like if they sign up for a newsletter, are we required to notify them that we might store their IP, email, etc.? Good question, and actually a perfect example. Eric, I might even steal that for my next presentation. So yes, you're allowed to hold that PII data as long as that user indeed is aware that you're holding it through the terms of conditions, but you need to also notify exactly what you're doing, right? So if you're signing up for this newsletter, we're holding your IP, your email, your name, blah, 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 because of, well, the reason is we're processing your information and we're sending you newsletters. Could be as simple as that. That's also what GDPR asks. Explain it simple so everybody understands it. But you need to put that into your terms and conditions. So just check your terms and conditions again. See if everything's in there. If not, adapt them. Make sure it's got the good ones, and you're good to go. Ah, Mr. Stewart, I think this is a great remark. This may be naive, but it seems that this is HIPAA on steroids. True? Um, well, I'm not gonna talk about steroids, but we believe at this point in time that EU has set the bar, and we believe that in the future, the next, I don't know, 5 to 10 years, you're probably going to see every country, or at least a lot of the countries, are going to adapt their privacy rules as well. And this regulation, this legislation, is going to be the bar for any of them. So is it on steroids? You might consider it like that. Again, we kind of welcome it. It looks like a lot of work. It is a lot of work. I told you that from the beginning. But it's good for the people, it's good for the customers, good for the businesses in the long run. So yeah. Is May an absolute date for compliance? Unfortunately, yes. You cannot ask for delayed compliance as far as I know. Will this presentation be available to people who attended this webinar? Yeah, sure. Probably not this week anymore, but I'll try to send it somewhere this week to the organizers of the webinar and make sure that, I believe they always send an email afterwards with some resources, and yeah, you can have those slides for sure. Patrick, thanks again. Yeah, I talked about this as well, right? But you must, Patrick tells me, you must also inform people that you receive data from another party company. That is correct. And that also, that's when you talk about those partnerships, right? If you talk about those partnerships, if you receive data from other companies, make sure that it's known, make sure the other company is in compliance as well. And correct, you need to talk about it as well. Where do we find the local laws for the US? That is a good question, Paul. And I'm afraid I don't have the answer to that one specific. I only know that at this moment, the US is working on some things because they need to change a few things to become also uh, a safe country for the EU, which I'm 100% positive it will happen by the 25th of May, but be aware that is happening. All right, and with that, I don't see any more questions anymore. Thanks for all of you who said that this was a great presentation. Very happy to hear that. But it's 8 o'clock, at least 8 o'clock at evening. My time will be at top of the hour or another, depending on your time zone. So I'm going to leave you so you can continue your journey for the day, or if you still have to work, good luck, I would say. If you're already done with working, enjoy the evening, and hopefully we'll hear and see you at one of our other events, maybe live, maybe at a webinar. If you want to learn more, we've been getting more and more of this type of information on our executive blog. So go to veeam.com, go to the executive blog where my partner in crime, Danny Allen, our Vice President of Product Strategy, is talking about all of these 5 lessons as well. We are going to share white papers on it as well. I talked about the surveys, they are coming as well. So we are going to continue to hand out the material from things that we have learned. Obviously, we're gonna, make them a little bit more clean. And then you can download them and use them within your own companies. Thank you very much, and hopefully see you or talk to you at one of our next webinars. Bye-bye.